Hi there. My name is Miss Townsend and I love math. Welcome to Math with Townsend. This video is for grade 9 applied students who wanted a bit more help reviewing for the EQAO. It's video number 3. And again, what we're doing is we're looking at the EQAO questions from last year's EQAO, which can be found on this website. And we're just going through question by question. If you have questions about what I'm taking up, please post them in the comments. Or if you want more of a particular type of question, please post that as well. So we're on to question number 7. Question 7 says that the equation d equals 3.6 times the square root of h represents the relationship between the distance d that a person can see in an open field in kilometers and the person's height h in meters. So hopefully you know that a lot of this is kind of just, important information they have to tell you, but as long as you know that d is distance that you can see and h is the height of the person. One afternoon, Amy can see a distance of 4.5. Which of the following is closest to Amy's height? So make sure you know here that the information I'm given that says 4.5 is the distance that Amy can see. So that's distance right here. Which of the following is closest to Amy's height? Height is what goes here. Okay, so make sure that you can read and interpret the information properly, obviously. So how are we going to actually figure out which one of these numbers is the valid number? So we're going to do this very similar to what we did in question number 6, which is when all else fails, and sometimes it's the only and best method, we're going to take each of these values that could represent height, and we're going to see which one works. So we know we're supposed to get a distance of 4.5. So keep that in mind. I want a distance of 4.5. So let's take A. So 3.6 times the square root of 1.1. So obviously this is a calculator question. 3.6 times the square root of 1.1. So your scientific calculator should be able to do that all at once. And that gives me about 3.78. I want it 4.5. I didn't get it. It can't be this one. Next, I'm going to use 1.6. 3.6 times 1.6. So again, in my calculator, I'm going to do 3.6 times square root of 1.6 equals, and I get 4.55, which rounds to 4.6. So that's the answer I wanted, pretty close to 4.5. So that's the answer I want. Now, if I had more time, so on the EQAO, when you have more time, you can always go and check that the other answers are wrong. But if you know that you're going to be pressed for time, when you get the right answer, stop and move on. Now, I want to talk about the other method you could have used to get the right answer, and it's called equation solving. And again, it's something we did earlier in the year, but I know it was probably one of the least liked units, and we certainly didn't look at anything quite like this, but let's look at it anyway. Again, we know the distance is 4.5, so I'm going to substitute the value for the distance that I actually know. And that gives me, an equation where there's one unknown value, and that value is h. So think of it as if the value was x. We're always trying to solve for the unknown. In this case, the unknown is h. So I have to undo all the math that I'm doing to h. For example, I'm multiplying by 3.6. How do you undo multiplication? Well, the answer is division. So to undo multiply, you do divide. So on both sides of the equation, I've divided by 3.6. What happens on the right is this simply cancels out this. And so I'm left with the square root of h. On the left, I can use my calculator, 4.5 divided by 3.6, and that gives me 1.25. Now I've almost solved for h. All I have to do now is get rid of square root. Well, the opposite of square root is square. So on both sides of the equation, we're going to square the value. On the right, square and square root cancel. I'm left with h. On the left, in my calculator, 1.25 squared is 1.56, which is, if I round to one decimal place, 1.6 meters, which is, of course, the answer B. Two different methods, whichever one you prefer, that's the one you go with. Let's look at the next question. A candle made of wax is in the shape of a cylinder. Which is closest to the total amount of wax to make the candle? And they've given you a hint. They've actually told you what the formula for volume is. And it's nice that they do this because, you know, the first thing you would have to do otherwise is think, is this a volume or a surface area question? Well, certainly think about holding a candle. A candle is not just a thin little edge of wax, it's a solid chunk of wax. So this is a volume question. And again, the volume is pi r squared h. So let's look at the diagram and see what we have. Well, we know that pi is 3.14. Now radius. This number given to me is not radius, it's diameter. So let's cut it in half, and we know that the radius is 3. So pi times 3 times 3 times the height is 12. Now, don't forget, why did I do this? Because it said r squared, and that means radius times radius. Some of you have a squared button on your calculator. That's fine too. But I like to remind you visually what it means to say something is squared by writing it out twice. So multiply all those numbers together, and I get 339.12, and it would be centimeters cubed. So if I look through here, oh, excellent. It looks like for sure that the answer is B. Good, a straightforward volume question. Really make sure you remember that diameter is not radius. You have to cut it in half. And make sure you remember that squared does not mean times 2. Okay, next question. Okay, now we know that we're not very happy about polynomial maths. Oops. So here's the question says to simplify this. This is a multiplication question. So before I look at this, I'm going to give you some easier questions and work up to this. So for example, let's say that this was what the question said. This says multiply 2 times everything in this bracket. So in this bracket, you should see that there is one term called negative 4x, and there is another term called positive 3. Okay, so again, I'm just going to recopy 2 times the first term and the second term. So that's all we're going to do is we're going to do 2 times negative 4x, and then we're going to do 2 times positive 3. It's called the distributive property, and all it means is that a bracket is affected by a number in front of it. So I'm going to multiply by 2, and then I'm going to multiply by 2. So 2 times negative 4x. Well, 2 times negative 4 is negative 8. 2 times 4 is 8, and there's a negative. And the x, well, that's just x, because nothing else impacted that x. So now I've dealt with the first term, and now I have to do 2 times positive 3. What's 2 times 3? 2 times 3 is 6, but I need to indicate if it's a positive 6 or a negative 6. So 2 times 3, well, they were both positive numbers, so that would give me negative 8x plus 6. Okay, so let's keep going. Now, let's say that I was actually multiplying by x. So remember, we're reviewing extensively before we look over here at the actual question. So let's say that I actually have this. So the number out front that I'm multiplying by is the number x. So that means, again, that x is going to get multiplied by negative 4x, and it's going to get multiplied by positive 3. So let's do those two pieces of math. X times negative 4x. Well, negative 4, because there's no number here to impact negative 4, but x times x is x squared. Now, what's x times positive 3? Well, it's just positive 3 and x because they don't change each other, they just multiply together. Now, make sure you're comfortable with the fact that x times x is x squared. That's such an important concept in math. You know that, for example, 3 times 3 is 3 squared, which is called 9. And 4 times 4 is 4 squared, which we know is 16. Well, x times x is just x squared. Okay, so that's what I did here. When I did x times negative 4x, I ended up with negative 4x squared. So now that we've talked about kind of the idea of how to deal with the distribution idea, let's look at the actual question that was given to us and see if we can get the answer. So we have negative 2x times negative 4x plus 3. So I never talked about that negative sign, right? Right. So let's pretend it doesn't exist. Now, obviously you wouldn't do this for real, but let's pretend. So if that wasn't negative 2x, if this is just 2x times this, and then times this. So 2x times negative 4x. 2 times negative 4 is negative 8. X times x is x squared. Good. So now I have to do 2x times positive 3. 2 times 3 is 6. X, well, that's still x. And again, I have to put a sign here. 2 times 3 was positive 6. Now, this would have been the right answer if I had positive 2x. But because what I had was, was negative 2x, then my answer is only different in the signage. Because now I'm going to do negative 2x times negative 4x. A negative times a negative is positive. 2 times 4 is 8. And x times x is x squared. Oops, I don't know why that keeps happening. But it's annoying. Okay, so again, negative times a negative is a positive. 2 times 4 is 8. X times x is x squared. Now I'm going to take this whole piece and multiply it by 3. Negative 2 times 3 is negative 6, and the x is just the x. So if I look over here, it's got to be the first one. Okay, so hopefully that's not too bad a situation. I mean, at the very, very, very least, if you hate this stuff, here's what you should do. So I'm going to reset the question. At the very least, please know that you're multiplying this and this by 2, right? So at the very least, I should see 8 and 6 in my answer. So even if nothing else makes a lot of sense to you, you know it can't be C or D, and at least you're down to a 50-50 shot. Okay? And then maybe, you would logically look at the fact that this and this have different signs. So my answer should have different signs. And then maybe that's a way you get the right answer, and you really aren't doing the proper math, but boy, you're being logical. So I'm noticing that I'm running out of time on this video, and I hope you don't mind that I'm kind of not rushing through anything. I'm really trying to make sure that anyone who comes to watch these videos really gets a good solid explanation. I hope you're finding them helpful. This was video number 3, so I'm going to meet you at video number 4.